Welcome to DuckDuckGo Economics. In this podcast, I want to analyze and perhaps understand US IR or international relations and foreign policy escalations. I want to do this in the context of the current conflict in Eastern Europe. And by current, I mean specifically the 13th of March 2022, the day when I'm recording this podcast, lest things should evolve quickly in the coming days. I do this against the backdrop of a panel discussion that's been quite popular on a lot of the streaming platforms that involve two, I would call them realist voices in America. And they are Professor John Mearsheimer and Mr. Ray McGovern. In this panel discussion, we also saw the voices of some ideologues. And this provides a very interesting contrast, but at the same time, a lot of things in common. And that helps me, gives me the incentive, in fact, to make today's podcast, because I really want to understand not so much what they think or what their interests are. I want to understand under what circumstances and how, when the United States may escalate. And by escalate, I mean something that is kinetic, something that is horrible, and something that for me, it's best to be avoided. So I wanted to divide today's podcast into 4 sections. I try to keep them concise, but there are some contents here that I think should be covered. First, I want to understand more I want to discuss the realist perspective. What the realist perspective specifically presented by Professor Mearsheimer and Mr. McGovern. And then I want to talk about the ideological perspective that is perhaps more widely accepted in the so-called quote-unquote collective West. And then I want to move on to understand a little bit of how the realists and ideologues how they act together, and what are some of the common values of Americans, and how they could interact. And finally, I want to talk about the escalations, the conditions that I see, and when that could possibly be taking place. So first of all, let's talk about the realists. And I must first apologize to Professor Mearsheimer. I know he doesn't really know me, and I'm sorry. And he certainly does not care. But I did make a podcast a few months ago discussing one of his earlier speeches on the issue of Eastern Europe. And in that podcast, I said basically that a lot of what he said is realism, but at the same time, it is also not so realist in the sense that it has an American perspective that is uniquely American. And I said in that podcast that his brand of realism is influenced strongly by the idea of manifest destiny. In other words, that America is the exceptional country, and that America has a certain set of rules and values that that America can uphold against all the others, where others do not hold similar positions in international relations. Now, at that point, I was only reacting to the specific speech that he made. And then I realized that actually Professor Mearsheimer is more or less a realist, except that his brand of realism is so-called offensive realism. In the sense, basically, it can be summarized in the sense that when possible, the strong will act as a hegemon. And even though today I still believe that his views are heavily influenced by him being an American and America being the hegemon, I do accept that he is a realist and his theory from his perspective also applies not just to America but also to other countries, specifically China. He thinks that China, given the opportunity, will also be a hegemon. So I want to make that clear. But I still think that he holds that view because he's an American and America is the hegemon. Anyway, let's talk about what they said in the aforementioned panel. Professor Mearsheimer, again, talked about his brand of offensive realism. And specifically in this panel, he said, essentially, if I understood him correctly, that the United States cannot defend that certain Eastern European country against its bigger neighbor. And as a result, the United States should not have made the promise to that specific Eastern European country. And that America should not have escalated in that region, a region that is of little interest to itself. And he said in the end, again, I would say he repeated his idea in the end that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Mr. McGovern provided a lot more details about the situation, about the background, the backdrop against which the operation, the current conflict has taken place, has escalated. And he said, essentially, that the United States committed a strategic mistake to alienate both Russia and China and to provoke both at the same time. And that America is providing a situation that threatens its hegemonic position. So these are the views of the realists from America, and from my understanding, especially from my reviews of the position of Professor Mearsheimer, it is that the realists hold that for America to uphold its pole position, for it to sustain its liberal brand of ideology, of global international order, it is important for America to get close with Russia and to keep Russia from China. This way, and I would say perhaps they also think, even though a lot of them are not speaking openly, they hope that they will, number one, either be able to pillage Russia for its natural resources, like they did in the 1990s, or if perhaps one step further, they could provoke an armed conflict between Russia and China, so that they could not only weaken Russia, but also weaken China as well, and alienate both, perhaps just alienate China and to subjugate Russia. That would be the ideal, because this would provide them with a condition that can help them maintain the hegemonic position in global affairs. I'm saying this primarily from the perspective of this so-called quote-unquote offensive realism. I must make a disclaimer that I don't really know the works of Mr. McGovern very well, so I cannot say that whether this is his view as well, but perhaps I'm quite confident that this is the view of Professor Mearsheimer. That's the realists. What about the ideologues? Now this is when we move to the second part of today's podcast. In that panel discussion, the moderator was clearly an ideologue, and there were several ideologues who posted comments and asked, I think, not really questions, but they made their comments. Some of them are ideologues. And from my reading of the American media, of the American thought leaders, if there ever are some, it is that they believe that they openly express the view. I don't know if they believe it, but they openly express the view that America should uphold the liberal international order. And specifically, there are 3 points. Number one, that America should fight for democracy and self-determination of peoples. Number two, that America should interject, even militarily, to fight for the aforementioned values. And thirdly, that no country should no country deserves a buffer zone. Now let me just discuss this a little bit. The first point that democracy and self-determination is are things or values that Americans should fight for abroad. I think there's something of an oxymoron here, or a concept that does not correspond with logic. Because if America, being an outsider, or Americans being outsiders, interject into the domestic policies of a certain country, then it is by definition foreign interference, and that undermines the democracy and self-determination of its peoples, of the peoples of the country in question. So that is complete nonsense. Number two, that America should fight for these values in those countries to protect those. I think America has not fought such wars, perhaps ever. America has fought for its interests. America has fought Mexico numerous times. America has fought the Europeans numerous times, has fought in Asia Pacific numerous times, and each time and also in the Middle East, I must not leave that out, and also in Latin America, in Africa, and all over the world, America has always sold democracy and freedom, self-determination as the product. But what people who bought what America sold, received, was never what they sold. Right? This is false advertising. The ideologues who believe this are essentially either naive, or they are straightforwardly selling war, and they are wrapping war in a beautiful wrapping paper, but the paper is so thin that lights shine through. The third point, that's about no country deserves buffer zone. This point I kind of actually agree. But at the same time, the situation in Eastern Europe currently is not so much as the establishment of a buffer zone. It is primarily a military, I would say, aggression, right, by the West in that region, with the specific aim to threaten another country, a country that it does not hold to be an equal, and a country that it hopes will be able to subjugate. So these are the views of the ideologues and how I think about them. As I said, I think the ideologues, some of them are naive. A lot of the American people are also naive, and they are misled, or perhaps led. Let's not say misled, right? They are led by ideologues to hold views that are ideological, that does not reflect, not just in reality. Obviously, the ideological views don't necessarily reflect realities, but also against the interests of themselves, of the American people. Very few actually benefit from the empire, and yet the empire just carries on. At the same time, some of the ideologues are not real ideologues. And this is when I think the realists and the ideologues really interact. Because I really do not believe that a lot of the American leaders or the leaders in the West are really naive type of ideologues. They are instead realists, and perhaps even the so-called quote-unquote offensive realists, who use ideology as an excuse to impose their brand of hegemony. And this is what I was trying to make, the point I was trying to make in one of my earlier podcasts. And I think I was a bit unclear, and I was mistaking. I think I perhaps criticized Professor Mearsheimer too much, right? Because it is there, since he has not reviewed himself as an ideologue, all he said was his brand of offensive realism, and perhaps that's all it ends. And in which case, he's not an ideologue. But I think a lot of the ideologues do agree with him on many issues, and I don't think those ideologues are naive. Not all of them. This moves us to the third section, and I think this is going to be quite a brief section. Specifically, the point that I want to make in today's podcast. One point that I hope that people who listen to this podcast can take away is my view that don't think that a lot of the people in the United States, the elites, are stupid. They are not. When they are selling ideologies, they are not really, they are marketing ideologies, but what they are selling is what can get them to maintain the hegemony. And this is the main point, essentially, that there is not so much difference between ideologues and realists. And the realists, in fact, help us understand how in America, how the ideologues think. Because the ideologues, in my belief, what they think is that if America does not maintain its hegemonic position, if America does not control the world would turn against America, and there will be a new hegemon, and America will be suppressed, American people will be subjugated, American interests will be lost. They may be right, they may be wrong, but one thing I must say, and this has to do with their brand of so-called quote-unquote offensive realism. The more America pushes these ideologies, the less likely it is for a multipolar world. It is more likely for a bipolar world to form. And it would be a world that will have a grouping of countries that will compete against the United States first and foremost. Because America is, choosing the world or all the other major powers as its enemies. When you have so many enemies, when you make the world your enemy, the real situation in the world will be such that they will be against you. Now, this does not promise stability or instability. It's just how things will evolve. Now, this is the third section of today's podcast. Now, let's move on to the last one. And how, basically, this is how and when America would escalate. We have seen that America has already escalated in, I think, mostly two ways. One is financial and economic. In this, I believe that America has committed, or perhaps the West has committed a fatal error. It is fatal to the position of the US dollar. It is fatal to the economic dominance, the central position of the Western financial system in global trade, in global economies. I have made this point numerous times in previous podcasts, so I'm not going to delve deep into this. And another escalation that, by the way, the first escalation, the financial economic ones, I think they have perhaps already maxed out. I do not see any more that can come. And they are not necessarily having the expected results. This, I don't think, is necessarily a point about whether it is the realists in control or whether it's the ideologues in control. I think it is rather that there is a lot of emotion and that the current crop of leaders in the West are a bit incompetent. I think people who are pulling the strings perhaps have not been able to get through, because you see, when you put people, emotional people, incompetent people in power, and you believe that you have control of them, you do not necessarily all the time, not all the time. When they lose control, you also lose control. And I think that is likely what has happened. The second area of escalation has been on the PR or technology front. If we read some of the news outlets and if we use some of the technology platforms, we will be, restricted, and our views will be guided, of course, from the kindness of their hearts, in a direction that corresponds, obviously, with what is righteous and what is great. And of course, there's this point that I want to make, and this is a slight digression. I sometimes visit the website of the so-called quote-unquote daily hate, because its comment section is just so funny all the time. And if you believed daily hate, and I thought this from just 2 weeks ago already, If you believe the daily hate, then I call it the Das Reich division. It would be already in the outskirts of Moscow and about to overtake Stalin from the Kremlin, to take Stalin, capture Stalin from the Kremlin, and the USSR would fall, and of course the Reich would have won, right? And all the glory to freedom, or glory to democracy, and so on and so forth. That obviously is not reality, and this leads me gives us a clear view of what opinion is being shaped, right? An opinion is being shaped in particularly an ideological way. And this goes back to a point that I made earlier, that the public can be misled to believe in all these value talks, right? That there is democracy and self-determination, that is something that worth fighting for, and America should fight for these values in foreign countries, and that no country should have a buffer zone, and therefore democracy should be brought to their borders, and of course eventually democracy and self-determination should be brought within the borders of the countries. And of course, when talking about democracy and self-determination, it is really what that means is American dominance. But let's not say it that way. We say it's democracy and self-determination. So that is the current situation. We see that it's what really disappoints me is the decision by DuckDuckGo to join the club and become one of the good boys. And of course, I stopped using DuckDuckGo because it's, in that sense, only a poor copy of the good search engine. And the good search engine is, it's more transparent. So in that case, I think perhaps I don't use the fake privacy, search engine. I want to make actually a podcast perhaps tomorrow, but certainly within the next couple of days, specifically on technology. So if you're interested, do watch out for that podcast. The one area where the collective West has not escalated into, not yet, is direct armed conflict. And this is, I think, where it's most interesting, because, not necessarily interesting, but the conditions under which they would intervene militarily. That is something that I really want to understand, because that can spell the end of a lot of civilizations and a lot of people. And from my understanding, interpretation of the realists and the ideologues, I think the realists, if their voices prevail, I think there will not be a military escalation. Then in that case, what I mean is that NATO and the United States will not engage in Eastern Europe militarily. If the naive ideologues, if they are to prevail, and the naive ideologues, I think they do exist, and when you have a weak administration, it is possible that the weak ideologues, the naive ideologues, may actually stage certain so-called false flag activities that force the hands of the West to engage militarily and to escalate militarily. At which point, I think it will be really bad for Central and Eastern Europe and perhaps for the world at large. Then there is this special brand of ideologues who are actually realists and who are only selling ideology as a way to exercise their realism in dominance. This brand of people, I think, again, at heart they are realists and they do not want to fully destroy the system from which they derive their power. That means that they will not escalate militarily. But we don't know if some of these people have some certain crucial interests in that region, and those interests could be exposed. And this is something, of course, I do not want to discuss too much or in too much depth on the great good technology platforms, because certainly this is a forbidden topic. So I don't. But just know that some of these of this special brand of ideologues, these realists who are selling ideologues, these are the most cynical people. And these are the people who are, for lack of a better word, criminals, international criminals. A lot of times, war criminals. And these people, what they are willing to do to preserve, to save their own skins, well, it's something that we do not want to see. So in this sense, in the final analysis, I think it would be great if there are some open realists in America whose voice can be actually be more popular and more widely accepted. And that includes Professor John Mearsheimer. As I said, I thought perhaps, it was just a makeup for, imperialism, and this brand of offensive realism can actually be exactly what some of the ideologues were thinking. But at least he does not say that America should escalate, and he says the polar opposite. Even though I do not agree with him on his brand of realism, I think that this is perhaps the best we can do for America, because Americans live in a reality that is different than the realities of the rest of the world. Namely, that America is the world's dominant power, that America has enjoyed security. It has buffers on both with two oceans and relatively weak neighboring countries, and very few of them. That gave America the specific, this unique geographic protection that's combined with the resources that was available, that is still available in the main continent, and I must say, the diligence of the American people. That's what built America. The same set of situations are not occurring and are not repeated elsewhere. Americans don't understand that there are some big countries, old civilizations, and I'm talking about the Indian ones, the Chinese ones, the Persian ones, and even the Ottomans, the Greeks, and to a certain extent the Roman ones. Even though the Roman Empire, that's not the case now. these old ancient civilizations sometimes resulted to hegemony. Case in point, the Roman Empire, but there, and also I must say the Arabs, right, the Ottomans. But then there are civilizational states, the Indians and the Chinese, who are decidedly more peaceful. So his brand of offensive realism certainly applies to American thinking, and perhaps to a lesser degree to European thinking, perhaps even to a more stronger degree, I don't know, Western European thinking. But, that's the best we can do. And we cannot expect Americans to appreciate a realist global order that is multipolar. They think that if we look at the world from a realistic perspective, there's got to be one country that dominates all others. Well, be that as it may, the realists are the ones that could stop America from can stop the world from entering World War III. And in that, I think the realists in America should be the ones that win out in this debate. Well, this is today's podcast. I hope that you find some of the points interesting, some of the points that I've raised in it interesting. And please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Also, I've uploaded this podcast to Rumble and Odyssey. So if for some reason you have difficulty, perhaps in the future, finding this channel or finding the specific topic, this podcast, you can always go back to Rumble and Odyssey to find them. And I have also my own website, theRGLT.com, where I think I will post links to these podcasts. Thank you very much, and have a great day.